Please be seated. I want to begin by expressing my deep gratitude to Mother Susie and Father John for their leadership of the worship the past few weeks and their availability to this congregation. I have heard many comments, and every one of them were very positive, and I am very grateful to the two of you for what you did and what you continue to offer to Iona Hope. Thank you. I want to offer my gratitude to you as well for the 2 weeks off. I'm a better person for it. Maybe not that good, but I'm a better person for it. It's interesting to have this kind of time. As you know, it has its value in part in changing our routines. Instead of getting up at 4 or 5 or 6, I was able to sleep late until 7 or 7:30. The day was half gone by the time I got up. And it offered the wonderful possibility of staying up late at night. I had planned to stay up and watch Saturday Night Live, which I don't often get to watch. It didn't happen. But that had nothing to do with not being able to or having to get up early the next day. I just couldn't stay awake. One of the great benefits of the time off was I discovered something. I discovered I have a wife. And that's not something to take lightly. Being able to be away from the routine of work and the emotional and spiritual sorts of investments that I have here reminds me of just how important she is in my life. And the dog and the cat asked me to also be reminded of them too. But it was very key and important for me in that regard. One of the things, having been in this vocation for so long, one of the things I have never seen is when a commission on ministry interviews a potential candidate for ordination, have they ever asked, are you willing to give up your weekends? I've never heard them ask that, but one of the benefits of having time away is that I had weekends. And that's really strange, and it may not seem that big a deal to you, but everybody else has weekends. But Saturday and Sunday are part of my work schedule. So to not have to do that, Nancy and I joke about it. Some Saturday afternoons about 2 o'clock, I'll go, I'm just not going in today, let's go out to dinner. Or on Sunday morning, I'll get up and say, let's just go to the beach instead. You have the option to do that. I don't. At least it's not one that I would exercise. And I think that's an important statement. I think that having that kind of demand is an expectation of the vocation. It's a part of what it means to be who I am, to live out my call in this world. And I would not give this up in order to be able to have my weekends free, even though at times it's nice to have them. But if you talk to some people, they say that is a deal breaker for them to attend church. I don't want to go to church because it takes away my weekends. And weekends are weekends. I want my weekend. Right? Or perhaps, unlike it was when I was a child growing up in the buckle of the Bible Belt, there are so many activities geared around the weekend. When I was growing up, No one ever thought of having a baseball game on Sunday morning. Yet, that's a common factor. It's something with which we deal every week. It's one of the challenges for young families in being a part of a congregation. It happens on weekends. Well, sometimes they fit it in other times, sometimes not. So, we make particular choices that have to do with how we live out our faith. So it brings up for me a question. What are the limits in our lives? How far is as far as we will go for Christ? Think about it. We often put that in a smaller context of, this is as far as I will go in this particular place. And sometimes it gets caught up in congregations or denominations. Well, I'm not going to go back to church there because someone hurt my feelings. Maybe they did it intentionally or sometimes by accident. Or maybe that particular place is not living out the faith as I understand it, and I need to go because of that, so I will go somewhere else. Or maybe I've just had it with all of them and I'm not going to go anywhere. But at what point in your life and in your journey would it be so much to that point that you would say, I am no longer going to follow Jesus? I'm no longer going to follow Jesus. It's an important question, and it's one that was raised by the writer of the Gospel of John, not just by my pontificating on my time off. But in today's Gospel, we have the continuation of this 6th chapter of John that we've had for 4 weeks. 4 weeks on the bread of life. It's one good reason for me to take off the 2 middle ones and let Mother Susie preach. But today, as we come into this reading, John shifts it a bit. Jesus is teaching in the synagogue, and he's teaching, continuing about the bread of life. But he does something different this time. Before, you could pretty much accept this bread of life thing, the bread and the wine, as being metaphor. As is, or as if. But today, the way Jesus engages us in this reading, it is much more literal. It is about flesh. And it is about blood. And there's an element of that, you may read that and you go, well, that sounds a bit cannibalistic. Well, yes, it does. I don't think that's where John was going with it, but it does sound like that. But what it is about, what John wants us to hear about, is Jesus talking about the enfleshment of God. The enfleshment of God. This body holding God. Now, you think cannibalism is bad. When he began to talk about this sort of thing, that's when his disciples kind of got restless. Now, let's be clear about the disciples. Often when you and I make a comment about disciples, we talk about the 12. We're usually talking about the apostles when we name those. But even when we talk about the 12, there were others. There were women, there were other men. And even he mentions the 12 today in the reading. But what we know is we don't know how many disciples there were. There was a huge crowd that had been following him throughout this 6th chapter of John. And they're the ones gathered there on that day. And when Jesus started talking about the enfleshment of God, about God as flesh and blood, that's when they looked up and they said, we're out of here. We're not going to continue with this. We've met our limit. What is your limit? What is your limit? When will you stop following Jesus? It's an important question. And I don't expect you to answer it right now because I hope it's too big and too important for you to give some sort of flash response to. Now, what I'm talking about is I'm not talking about this microcosm, this congregational thing. I'm not talking about when you're going to stop attending church here, there, or anywhere else. I'm not talking about when you would decide to not be an Episcopalian. Would you choose to leave and not follow Jesus for any particular reason? That's your first question. But the second question that you and I have some obligation to entertain is, why are we here? What holds us here? That's part of that same consideration, isn't it? And I want to suggest to you that you and I have information that those disciples did not have, the ones that left that day. And I think that this is the most important information that you and I can have. And it's this. At the end of the chapter, Jesus is still there. Jesus went nowhere other than to continue on his journey. You and I have the value of the Scriptures and the traditions and the history to know that what happened there and what Jesus was trying to convey to these people in a radical way at that time is the core of what our belief is. That God was enfleshed. God became human. God did not back out on anyone. He tried over and over to get our attention throughout history, through various people and activities and events. Finally, he said, the only way it can happen is I've got to become you. And then maybe, just maybe, you can see my love. Let me ask you, when you hear that, what is your limit? God's presence in continuation with us is limitless. How do we respond? Amen.